It is my pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight. I thank you for being here as always on a Tuesday night at 5 o'clock Pacific Coast time. We have two students who will be introducing our speakers tonight, Kenza and Davin. Kenza, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. So hello all. Today, Davin and I, Kenza, will be introducing three fantastic speakers. And now I'm going to pass on to Davin.
Hi. Hello all. This evening should prove to be quite exciting, not just because of the election, but because our three speakers are quite knowledgeable about tech startups and investing. The first speaker is Erik Nordlander, a general partner at Google Ventures. Erik earned his undergraduate degree in computer science and electrical engineering at MIT, as well as completed graduate research at MIT's Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Laboratory, focusing on unique data extraction and disk forensics. He then became a developer at Google, where he created a distributed file system still used by Google.com and Gmail today. And then following that, he led a team that built statistical and machine learning models for Google's ad businesses, as well as assisted with Google's $3 billion acquisition of DoubleClick in 2007, where he helped with their subsequent technical integration before moving to Google Ventures in 2010, where he is now a general partner who currently manages their New York City operations and leads their enterprise investing team.
Thank you, Davin. Now I'll be introducing the second and third speakers, Spencer Kimball and Peter Mattis. Spencer Kimball and Peter Mattis were both roommates at UC Berkeley while there as part of a class project. Both Spencer and Peter co-founded GIMP Software, a free image manipulation program used by millions. They both graduated from Berkeley in 1997, with Spencer earning a degree in computer science and Peter earning his degree in electrical engineering and computer science. Following graduation, Spencer co-founded and served as co-CTO of Vigo, a company providing tools for building web communities. Then both Spencer and Peter served as software engineers at Google in the early 2000s, where they spearheaded Colossus, a new version of Google's file system. After leaving Google in 2012, both Spencer and Peter launched the app company Viewfinder, which was later acquired by Square 2 years later, following Viewfinder's acquisition. Both founders served as senior members of Square's East Coast team before co-founding Cockroach DB. Cockroach is a distributed database with standard SQL for cloud applications with customers like Comcast, eBay, SpaceX, Bose, etc. Cockroach Labs most recently raised $85 million at an incredible $866 million valuation with investors including Sequoia, GV, Benchmark, Index Ventures, etc., with plenty of room for future growth. Currently, Spencer Kimball serves as Cockroach's CEO and Peter Mattis serves as the Vice President of Engineering. Thank you and welcoming all three speakers for a wonderful session ahead.
Thank you, guys. Erik, I'm going to let you take it away, and we'll be in the background.
Thank you very much for the great introductions. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you, and especially Pete and Spencer, who I've known for a long time and are good friends and also now members of the GV portfolio. Given that we're here at your alma mater, I thought it'd be great just to rewind the clock back to the beginning, really, and find a point of the journey before you guys met. So I'd love to start by asking, how did you guys get started with programmers? You were both computer science graduates at Berkeley. What was your first exposure to programming and what was that like? I'm sure it's very different than what students are experiencing today.
Grief, that's a long time ago. My first memory of doing programming was on an Apple II Plus. I remember going to the bookstore with my parents, because you went to bookstores back then. We didn't have Amazon. And I remember finding a book on basic programming and just typing in programs from that, that book into the computer in order to do like really just simple basic programs. Like BASIC is computer language, by the way, if you don't know. That was just ancient times, must have been like 10 or 11 years old. And I can kind of continue that on into high school. Took a computer science class, the AP computer science class in high school, ended up writing a little like kind of, not really a virus, but a little prank thing that ran on our journalism computers that really pissed off my teacher back then. But that was good times. That's kind of where I got my start, just doing like little, fun little games and fun little programs like that.
The first time I programmed was on a TI-99 4A, which is this Texas Instruments made home computers back in the day. And it actually recorded its data onto a cassette tape recorder. And I remember watching the movie War Games and being so impressed that there was this advanced AI that could talk to Matthew Broderick. And he actually ended up hacking into this government system. Anyway, it inspired me, and I wrote a simple basic program like Pete. That's kind of where he started back then. And it had a bunch of if-else routines, but it would respond to queries, and kind of like the Whopper computer in War Games. So it was love at first sight when I saw that movie, and I always wanted nothing other than to be a programmer from that moment on.
That's awesome. I wonder if everyone in the crowd even knows what a cassette tape is, Spencer. So maybe we'll circle back on what that is. But obviously, the beginning of that journey led you to Berkeley, and I think there was one part in the bio that we missed, which was around some open source programming that the both of you did while at Berkeley. So maybe you guys can just talk a little bit about how you met each other, and some projects, some open source projects that you worked on back in the day.
Yeah, well, I mean, the meeting's kind of interesting because you know this, Erik. Spencer's a year older than me, so he was in Berkeley a year before I was. My brother's 2 years older than me, and he was in the same dorm room with Spencer. And dorm, I think, were you on the same floor? I'm not sure if the same floor.
Yeah, it was Unit 3, Norton Hall.
Yeah, so Spencer and my brother became friends, and before I even got to Berkeley, I think my first year is when I got to Berkeley, they had moved into an apartment off out of the dorms. So it was my brother and Spencer who were friends first. And I think I maybe met you in 1992, 1993, maybe came up to visit my brother once, and Spencer was there. There's another friend, Sandy. I think you were both barefoot. I was shocked. I don't know what Berkeley was all about. I was just like this naive high school student. That was kind of my first recollection of meeting you.
Yeah, I remember your brother, who was in mechanical engineering. I was in computer science at the time. He told me that his little brother was a crack computer programmer, and I was a little bit doubtful. So I was thinking that you wouldn't be all that he was cracking you up to be, but I was quite impressed when we did meet, and we just started to hang out a lot. And we were both extremely interested in Unix. That was new to us. You have to understand that back in 1993, 92, we were coming from the world of Mac OS and Windows 95 or Windows 3.1 probably at the time. And those systems were pretty basic compared to what Berkeley had in terms of even its oldest workstations that were Unix based. And that's where we were first exposed to free software and open source. It was a new thing to the sort of broader public back in 92. And we were impressed, and we wanted to use Unix in that environment. And I was eager to never touch Microsoft stuff again at that point. It became like a real zealot about it, in fact, for a little while. And the problem was that there weren't any good desktop applications in the world of Unix back then. And so coming from, Pete had Photoshop on his Macintosh at the time, and it's a pretty great piece of software even then. What was available on Unix were these two programs, Xpaint for making small and pretty basic modifications to images, and XV for viewing images, but that was about it. So we decided, you know what, we want something like Photoshop. We want it on Unix. We never want to go back and forth between these operating systems. We just want to use Linux at the time. And so we sat down, wrote a manifesto. Hey, what are we going to build here? And we started working on it. And it actually consumed the next 4 years of our lives at Berkeley.
Did not know how much time I was going to spend on that when we got started. Yeah, I think that's true of most projects. You start working on them like, I'll just, fool around with this. I'll just kind of, doodle around and see what can be done. And then it kind of keeps on growing. It gets a life of its own. And then kind of, worms inside your brain. You can't stop thinking about, oh, I want to add this new feature. I want to add that new feature. And before you know it, it's pretty full featured.
Yeah, the joy of creating that next feature is what keeps you going, and it actually deepens the investment and an ultimate satisfaction. So that's always been the impetus behind all of the projects I've done, from that first War Games emulator all the way to Cockroach Labs.
Yeah, I do recall seeing a version of Peter's resume at one point that said every Linux machine is using some of his software in GTK, I believe, whether they like it or not. And it's pretty incredible that you guys were able to create something that was used by almost every Linux distribution from those early days. Great. So I'd love to talk about kind of Berkeley and graduating. You guys obviously worked together very closely there, but then you went your separate ways. What was it like, kind of getting out of academia into the working world? What were the resources you were sort of looking at in terms of figuring out what to do? Were there any things that were particularly helpful or not? Maybe talk about just your early career.
I really feel like I did myself a disservice in that I didn't really pay attention to the career guidance that Berkeley was offering at the time. I mean, they might have been offering great stuff and I just completely ignored it. I took a couple interviews via like some kind of career center, and then I ended up taking a job at a startup. Erik Brewer, who's a professor then at Berkeley, and also I believe he's still a professor at Berkeley, he was doing a startup at the time, and he just said, hey, you should come interview at my startup, and I did. And then I just jumped onto that one. So there's kind of a huge dosage of luck in my ending up at that startup, which turned out to be a really great experience. I only stayed there for 2.5 years, but learned a ton. It was right during the .com bubble. The company we were at, the startup Inktomi, ended up going public, and I ended up, not getting money that I could retire on, but getting more than a 24, 25-year-old person should really have.
I actually took a very different route. I was, despite all of my love of programming, I had this sort of romantic notion that what I really wanted to do was be on the road and see new cities. And so I thought maybe being a consultant would be a good gig for myself. And I was also offered by Erik Brewer, hey, come interview at Inktomi. It'd be a great place for you to cut your teeth after graduating. But I was determined. So I went and joined Accenture, which was called Anderson Consulting back in '97. And it was interesting, but I didn't last very long there. I lasted 4 months. And then I decided, hey, I want to do something like investment banking. So I went and worked at a boutique investment bank. I lasted about a year there. And just at that point decided, hey, I'd like to come back and do this .com thing, which seems more exciting and more in line with what my actual true passion was, which is programming. And that's what I did. Did a .com startup and then went through the .com blow up, which is a whole nother story.
Yeah, actually, I mean, going through the .com, any like lessons learned? Because obviously things sort of rose very quickly, and then, the bubble burst and it felt like the whole Bay Area was kind of under a cloud. Any sort of, memories or insights from seeing some of those like quick successes and then quick failures so in such a short period of time?
It's funny, I thought I learned a bunch of lessons, and I think they have mostly been the wrong lessons since then. I kind of felt like, a lot of people got ruined in the .com boom when the bust occurred. They had, exercised a bunch of options in some way that created a tax liability, and then everything went to zero, and they were stuck with this unbelievable check that they owed the government, but they had no money to pay it. For people that lived through that boom and that bust, there was this very strongly held and understood lesson that you needed to be cautious, not just ride, put all your money on black and ride, that's a good way to end up in the poorhouse. And so it was much better instead to like say, okay, well, we've got these gains, let's take these gains, let's take them responsibly, let's diversify. And of course, then I went and worked at Google, and then I went and worked at Square and all these different companies where, oh boy, you want to just ride. If I'd never sold Google until today, I think I would have made a lot more from it. But, you know, money's not everything. And I think being cautious and conservative is probably a good lesson, even if it didn't necessarily apply so well to the rest of my career.
I also find it fascinating how many of the ideas that kind of went bust during the dot-com era came back around. You know, there was like the web van stuff, and you know that all kind of blew up, and there was other, you know, kind of pets.com and whatnot. And then these things have all kind of, you know, they were too far ahead of their time. The internet wasn't quite ready for that yet, and yet the underlying idea was good. It was going to do something that everybody wanted. We just didn't have the infrastructure in place. And, you know, there was this aspect of timing to certain ideas. I mean, this is jumping ahead, but I think there's an aspect to Cockroach TV. We couldn't have done it 10 years ago, certainly not 20 years ago when we graduated. Technologies weren't there yet. And I'm not just talking about like the technologies inside Cockroach TV. I'm talking about stuff outside, the networking infrastructure and data centers. When we graduated from college, if you want a machine in a data center, you had to go physically put a machine in a data center. Now, if I want a machine in a data center, you know, like it's just so easy to do. I just go online to Amazon or Google and put in my credit card, and I get it in like 10 minutes. This has materially changed what it means to do startups, especially in the software engineering industry today.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The timing is so important for any kind of entrepreneurial like success, and hopefully you guys got the timing right with Cockroach. So I'd love to just quickly touch on Google. You guys obviously had great timing coming in there early on, and that's actually where we all met, was in relatively early days of Google. You know, my memory of coming there was that it just had an energy to it. Like there was a buzz. You know, you'd go to lunch and you'd have these conversations, and you're surrounded by smart people, and the whole place just had kind of an electricity around it. So I'd love to understand, you know, you guys were there even before me. What was those early days like at Google? Because I think, you know, anyone who's an aspiring entrepreneur would love to, you know, recreate kind of the Google story if possible.
Yeah, well, I think the Google story had this one huge factor behind it, which is it arose right during the dot-com bust. And I think there was like kind of malaise in the industry where everybody was feeling kind of burnt. And where do the bright people go? And Google was like kind of just a magnet for all these bright people. And that was part of the reason there's an energy there. It's interesting. I don't know if you know this, Erik. I'm not sure if you know the story. I actually got a job offer from Google a year before I joined. So my timing was pretty good in joining Google. I joined in, it was April 2002. I could have joined in April 2001, which would have been much better timing. Ended up deciding at that time, which is interesting. You know, it's like, what's the kind of career advice you can take away from this? Well, things generally kind of work out. I was living up in San Francisco at the time. I didn't want to do the commute down to Mountain View. And that was my reason for declining in April 2001. And I worked at a startup in San Francisco for about 9 months, and I kind of saw it wasn't going anywhere. And Google called me back up and like, hey, you know, we're still interested in you. Are you still interested in us? And, you know, they lured me back. And, you know, then you kind of know the rest of the history. But as soon as I arrived at Google, what you described is absolutely correct. There's a buzz inside. At the time, Google's kind of AdWords product, which is kind of the oil gusher that they hit upon and that has been feeding all the revenue ever since. It was just in its early days, but everybody could see how much money it was turning out. And so there's an excitement. And then there's also this ambition from the founders, Larry and Sergey, about we want to change the world. It's not just search. I got in there, I was very early put onto Gmail, and there's just an energy, like, what can we do with Gmail? Oh, there's these other webmail systems. They're all kind of, you know, not very good. We're going to give Google class search, and actually we're going to give you a gigabyte of free storage. And the alternative offerings there were offering like a megabyte or 2 megabytes, and they were pathetic. And everything was kind of like ambitious and audacious. And I think that was part of, you know, that attitude that we were going to change the world was very, you know, spread throughout the organization.
Yeah, I think there's also, you know, to touch a little bit on the dot-com boom and bust. I mean, Google was started in '98 I remember walking, because our office in my startup WeGo was for a while in Palo Alto. I remember walking by on my way back to Caltrain, and you'd walk underneath this projector they had where they project on the sort of real-time search results that they were serving up the results to. And it was projected onto the sidewalks. You'd walk under that. I'd be leaving work at 10 p.m. or whatever. And I heard they had a chef. It sounded pretty cool. But the dot-com bust hit. You have to understand, 101 back then, when the dot-com boom was happening, was potentially even more crowded than it is today. When the bust happened, you could drive down 101. It's a lot of times you'd be the only car on it. It was like their tumbleweed going across 101. So that was, part of what drove all of the, that magnetism that Pete mentioned in terms of people that were very bright going to work there. And just the contrast for somebody like myself, and Peter also had been working at startups in the dot-com boom and bust. The contrast of to be at a place where it wasn't just successful, but seemed to be breaking all barriers in terms of the growth rate was incredible. And it felt like you're really in a special place where I think that was probably true at a lot of companies in the dot-com boom. But, in 2002, it felt singular, and that was a special feeling.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of good memories from those early days at Google, and you guys accomplished a ton there, and then you made the decision to leave and become founders, and that's that was obviously a big decision. So I'd love to know what that was like to make the jump from kind of being staff engineers to startup founders, and what did you take with you? Like, what were the positive things from Google you were taking with you as as you were forming new companies?
Wait, can we back up a second? Because you skipped over something super important, which is that when Erik first came to Google, he was still at MIT, and he came as an intern, and he was my first and only intern. So he actually ran smack in the middle of Peter and I on an internship. And so Erik, what was that like? What were we intimidating, or were we easy as sort of intern hosts?
I love that this is getting turned back on me. Well, it was great. I'll say this. It was one of those other kind of random things where, and I can't remember if you guys know this, I actually had a job set up for this summer. I had like an apartment set up to go and like work at this other startup. And I got a call from Google saying like, hey, do you want to interview for, for an internship? And I was literally sitting down to take a test. I was in like one of these giant, lecture halls. I just told them like, hey, I'm going to have to call you back. And luckily they were fine with that and ended up meeting you guys. So it was great. I mean, I think what I really remember from it was just, the level of scale at Google at that point was kind of just so far beyond what I was seeing in academia. I mean, Peter, what you were saying, like, hey, if I want to get a machine, at that point, even at MIT's grad school, it was like really hard to get resources. And at Google, if you wanted to run some MapReduce, with hundreds or maybe even 1,000 machines, you could just do that. You didn't even have to ask for permission. And so that was the thing I took away from it. Like the scale that Google was operating at, back in 03, 04 was so far beyond what was going on anywhere else in the industry or academia. And it was, technically the most interesting thing. And obviously getting to work with both of you was super, super exciting. So I'm glad I'm still the only intern.
Yeah, it's likely going to continue that way.
Yeah, we'll see. Maybe someone else at Cockroach will get the pleasure. Yeah. So maybe yeah. So you left Google. You left me there. I stuck around after that internship, and you guys became founders. And I think that was a pretty big jump. So I'd love to hear how that went, what you took with you, what worked, what didn't.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Why did we make the jump? Why did I make the jump? I can't really speak for Spencer, but I'll speak for myself. I was at Google for almost a decade. I think it was 9 years and 6 months. And towards the end of that time, a decade is a long time to spend at a company, especially in the software engineering world. And towards the end of the time, I felt like I was stagnating a little bit. I felt like I wasn't pushing myself. Google at that point was super comfortable. In the early days, I think I joined and there was 300 people in the company, maybe 350. I left, I'm not even sure what the number was, 10,000, 20,000, it doesn't really matter. It's kind of like,
60,000 feet, I think.
I mean, these
30.
numbers, like they're nosebleed numbers. They're just so gigantic. You can't possibly know everyone or be aware of what's going on. You just feel like a tiny cog in this great machine. And I just felt like I had it in me to challenge myself again. And certainly there was opportunity to do other interesting work at Google, but the challenge didn't feel like it was there. There's too much of a safety net at Google. If your project fails, nothing, you're going to roll on to another project probably. There's no real danger involved. And that was the part that had me interested in moving on, is to really stretch and push myself. And certainly a startup will give you that. I mean, I think that's the great thing about a startup is you're going to be stretched and pushed like you've never been stretched before. There is no one to fall back on, kind of all the responsibility falls on your shoulders. But with that, you're going to learn rapidly. You can't just turn and have a legal department or marketing department. You have to do and carry all those roles. It's very, very challenging though. I have to reiterate that for everybody who's interested, you're all in this class, you're interested in entrepreneurship. It is one of the most rewarding things you'll ever do, and it is one of the most challenging things you'll ever do.
And the highs are higher and the lows are lower. The lows can be pretty low. And that, I think my journey was similar to Peter's. I remember maybe a couple years before I did leave, actually starting to get, fatigued maybe at the monotony. It was a very pleasurable, comfortable monotony, but it nevertheless started to feel that way despite the very interesting work I was doing. And I thought, hey, maybe I'll go back to school and either do an MBA or potentially go back to do med school, just be a doctor. I mean, that's a pretty far cry from what I've been doing all my life, but that seemed interesting because I think, like Peter was saying, it felt extremely different and a new kind of challenge, and that was important. But it did turn out that, Peter and I starting the company, it's called Viewfinder, was a pretty huge challenge. So it's not wrong there. Definitely starting a company is, especially after 10 years at Google, it was profoundly interesting and challenging.
Yeah, and obviously, it was a challenge, and it had a good outcome though. You guys got sold to Square, and you went from kind of being founders to being back as engineers at a relatively large company, obviously not as big as Google. And I know you started working on some new projects there. So maybe can you guys talk a little bit about what it was like, kind of being at Square post acquisition, and what kind of led you to start working on new things again?
Yeah, well, when we got into Square, when we got acquired by them, it was really this term acqui-hired. They weren't acquiring Viewfinder for the technology; they were acquiring Viewfinder for the technical talent. Myself, Spencer, some of the other engineers we'd hired at Viewfinder. So we got in there, and they knew we were talented engineers. We actually went through an interview process as part of the acquisition, which is very common during acquisitions. The employees being acquired get interviewed. They knew we were going to be very senior engineers, but they didn't quite know what to do with us. We ended up on this project rewriting, this inventory system as part of Square's inventory service. Very interestingly, I somehow ended up working on Square's new version of their card reader, which was just kind of super fascinating. Actually, that was one of the most pleasurable things I did at Square, because I ended up working on embedded code. And the software engineering field, computer science, is vast. People work in graphics, people work in distributed systems and file systems and kernels. I'd never actually done anything on an embedded device. And just like working within the constraints of an embedded device, it was actually kind of fun. In order for the card reader to talk to a phone, it actually has to communicate over the microphone jack via modem protocols. And kind of working in that area was just all brand new. And I actually think that's one of the things that I would emphasize as being one of the more energizing aspects of my career is whenever I'm learning new things, it's sometimes a little bit stressful and straining to learn new stuff, but I always look back at it fondly. Those are some of the more rewarding times when you're pushing yourself to learn something new, and things aren't making sense for a while, then they kind of click, and you're like, there's like that kind of, almost the light bulb, appearing in your brain. I love that feeling.
Yeah, Square was an interesting transition for us. Exactly what you said. We're kind of going back into the arms of, it was still pre-IPO, but it was huge compared to Viewfinder, which was something like 14 people when we did the acqui-hire. Square was primarily based in San Francisco, and Viewfinder was in New York. Most of our employees, the team was in New York. So we joined a growing New York City Square office. There were already probably around 20 people there. And that was challenging because a small office that's set aside geographically from the mothership, which was San Francisco for Square, is difficult. You're kind of out of sight, out of mind. When you're participating in meetings, you're often the only one that's remote, and everyone else is focused on the other people that are live with them in the room, as opposed to looking up at the screen. And so you're not catching all the body language. And Square itself, as Peter mentioned, they were very interested in acquiring the team. They thought we're all very good technical talent. So that was sort of, on one hand, this seems like a great acquisition. On the other, they didn't have any specific things they wanted us to do. So that's one thing if you have all the new employees all being part of existing teams in the big office. It's quite another when those new employees are all sort of in a monolithic block in a remote office geographically. So that was a big challenge. I just decided pretty early on in my time at Square that I wanted to work on what it was already called Cockroach. So a little bit of history on Cockroach. The idea of it came, as you would know, Erik, because I asked you to read my original really weird design documents. But that came when we started Viewfinder. And we came out of Google, and we'd seen all these amazing database technologies at Google. And we got out into the world of open source instead of the world of Google's infrastructure in 2012. And there weren't any really good open source databases in the sort of, with the same kinds of capabilities that Google had already pioneered. So it felt like we were going from a sort of citadel on the hill, or Shangri-La kind of, which was Google's infrastructure, to a medieval village. It just felt like we came from extreme sophistication to a very disappointing 10 years behind, with things like, what did they have? MongoDB, React, which was another NoSQL system. There's Postgres and MySQL, which are great, but they weren't the sort of distributed systems that Google had been pioneering. And we tried all these different things in succession, and we came up feeling like they weren't nearly good enough. And that's where the idea of Cockroach was started. And when we got to Square 2 years after that, we didn't end up building Cockroach. It was more just an idea and a name, which was entertaining. We got to Square and we realized, wow, they needed databases for a lot of the same reasons that Google built them. A lot of the same reasons, even our startup, we felt like we needed this kind of a database like Cockroach. And so at Square, I just said, hey, you know what? I really want to work on Cockroach. And they were like, well, we don't really build distributed databases the way Google builds them. So this seems really ambitious. So I just sort of started it on the side as a nice and weekend project and got help from various people. And eventually Square let me work on it. So I worked on it for maybe 6 months while I was there, which was wonderful. And so my tenure at Square wasn't so much working on Square stuff as it was really trying to get my head wrapped around, hey, how do we build a database for the whole world that was similar to what Google had pioneered over the 10 years we were there?
Yeah, I'll never forget going to dinner and being handed like an actual paper version of the Cockroach design doc, and being really interested in what this might become. And certainly in the venture world, something you think a lot about is the founder sort of market fit. And for two guys that had built really the most scalable systems at Google, building a database for the rest of the world, I couldn't think of a better fit. So it was exciting to see you guys working on it, and it was really interesting to see what that might become. And luckily for all of us, and maybe not so lucky for Square, you were able to do it open source. You were able to do it in a way that you could take with you. And I think you spent probably a year, 18 months on Cockroach in various fits and spurts before it before leaving Square and really releasing it to the world. And starting a company. So I'd love to let's talk about the early days of Cockroach, and maybe even it's worth telling people what you know, a little bit behind the name and how you chose that, and you know, just the earliest parts of founding the company.
I can tell you about the name. So GIMP was named by Peter, Cockroach was named by me, but you can probably tell the flavors of the two names are a little spicy. That's just kind of our sense of humor. GIMP came out, we named GIMP right around Pulp Fiction coming out. So it really is an homage to the leather-clad figure that's kept in a box in the basement. If you haven't seen Pulp Fiction, I recommend you do. It's maybe not for the faint of heart. It's a pretty great movie though. Broke a lot of new ground. So Cockroach wasn't an homage to a weird Quentin Tarantino character, but it was just an idea that came to me. Obviously, living in New York, cockroaches are abundant. But when we were thinking, okay, how do you build something the way Google had built some of their database technology, but you do it completely open source? And the idea came to me that, well, okay, you're just going to want each node to be fairly independent in some respects. You don't want to have any node that has like a truly special dispensation. They all need to work together, but every node should be greedy about colonizing any disk space you give it. You give it a new machine, it's going to use all the disk space there, find equilibrium, greedily replicate itself to other nodes where it starts to lose data and so forth. And so, hey, you know, this sounds like a bunch of cockroaches colonizing your apartment. And that's really, the name amused me, and apparently amused a lot of other people, because even at Square, when I was talking about, hey, can Square really sponsor this project? You know, some people said, you've got to change the name. And one of the folks that was pretty high up in engineering there said, nope, this is a mind virus. You did not change the name now. Once this thing gets lodged in there, nobody will ever forget it. So that was good advice, I think.
I think the mind virus part is right. Have you guys ever had a Hacker News thread where the name is not discussed? I mean, I think it's sort of this permanent.
I think the moderators now silenced those comments because they were just getting out of control. I you know, the name, you know, my humor is just like Spencer's. I love the name from the beginning, but it's just fascinating that, you know, it gets a visceral reaction from people, but they don't forget the name. And I think that's kind of like an easy thing to overlook in marketing. You want people to think about your company happily, but you also want them to remember. And the database space is just littered with names of databases, CouchDB, OrangoDB, even MongoDB is kind of just still like, you know, it's forgettable, except for the company became successful regardless. It doesn't stick with you. We actually have something useful with the name Cockroach, and a lot of people really dislike the name. If you sit with it for a while, it becomes more palatable. We were told early on, I remember someone after a talk, when I gave a talk on Cockroach TV, came up to me afterwards, like, this is really interesting technology. There's not a single CIO in the world who will sign a check made out to Cockroach Labs. And this is before we actually made any revenue. And I was like, oh, okay, well we're going to do our best. I don't think we're going to change the name now. Turns out he's completely wrong, but I mean, like, that was the kind of reactions we were getting, that like, it really, you know, I think the mind virus part is, it turned out to just be a home run in terms of marketing.
I'll tell you a little bit more about the beginning of Google, or sorry, of Cockroach, because it's a pretty interesting point. You know, we came out of Google, we started a company with two other people, that was Viewfinder. We assumed when we started that company, Google had a pretty great culture, at least over my decade there. I really enjoyed it. I assumed, because Peter and I were starting this company together, that Viewfinder would have the Google culture. Because, hey, we just spent 10 years understanding the ins and outs of Google's culture, and you know, whatever new thing we started, you would expect the culture to reseed in that new incarnation. That did not happen. And that was a kind of painful lesson to learn, that in fact, you have to work at culture. And it's more than just saying it, you have to actually demonstrate it. And you demonstrate it from the top down and from the bottom up, but you ultimately have to pay attention to it. And so before we incorporated Cockroach Labs, Peter, myself, and Ben, who's our third co-founder, we sat down and we wrote a manifesto, which was really about how we do culture and how we do it differently and what we were going to do and pay attention to, so that we actually did end up with a culture. And that, I think, really worked. And that was, I think, you know, I don't hear that too often, that you come up with your culture before you really nail down exactly what you're gonna, you know, how you're going to incorporate, how you're going to split up equity and that sort of thing. So I think that was a painful lesson, and I think we have I'm very proud of the culture at Cockroach. So I think that was effective.
Yeah, I think so one of the things that you did after writing that manifesto was going out and raising some venture money. And yeah, I think that was probably one of the first pitches that I saw, at least, where the manifesto already existed for an early stage company. So that was really interesting. But yeah, I think that might be interesting for the audience to hear, just like, the with Viewfinder, you didn't actually raise institutional money, right? You got it from sort of friends and angels and things like that. And then with Cockroach, you went and pitched a bunch of VCs, and you got hopefully a number of great ones in the first round and subsequent rounds. So I think it would be wonderful to talk about that experience. And certainly the Cockroach name didn't stop you from getting investor interest. So.
No, with Viewfinder, we didn't take institutional money. We were a little bit, hesitant to take institutional money at Viewfinder. Our other co-founder was, quite, he was more pushing the friends and family, the angel route, get ourselves a little bit more established so we can get a good valuation. And ultimately, I think that was a mistake in hindsight. There's a little bit of a feeling at the time that VCs, they were kind of dumb money and whatnot. And that hasn't been my experience at all at Cockroach Labs. VCs are a huge value add to your company. They don't know the ins and outs of your technology, not necessarily the ins and outs of your business, but they know startups. And they have, all the VCs investors that we've interacted with have given absolutely great advice. And I think we actually made a significant misstep in Viewfinder in kind of staying away from the VC side of the world. Would it have made Viewfinder ultimately successful? I don't know, but I think we would have taken a better crack at that at bat than we did.
Yeah, I think you're more careful with friends and family's money, right? Whereas an institutional investor, they don't want to back. They don't want you to give them a little tiny return. They want you to keep swinging for the fences. And so you have more of an unqualified, would be the right word, up at bat. They want you to shoot for that grand slam. So if that's something that you're interested in, it's a lot easier to feel good doing that with institutional money than with your grandma's money or whatever. So we actually, with Viewfinder, we looked for an exit when we still probably had 10 months of runway, just because we thought, okay, this isn't working and we don't want to just end up with nothing. We'd like to give a good return to the folks that believed in us. That was big. I think it's a big difference. It's something to keep in mind for anyone in this audience that's thinking of being an entrepreneur. VCs I've only had good experience with them. We have some great VCs, as Erik mentioned. Benchmark was our lead. GV was participated along with Sequoia. So and there's a handful of others as well. But that's a pretty good lineup to get right out of the gate. And, to Erik's point, VCs had no problems with the name Cockroach.
It was kind of amusing, though, when we were doing that initial fundraising round where we took a little tour of Silicon Valley and we're going up and doing meetings with all these VCs. And I distinctly remember walking into their offices and they're like, "Oh, and who are you two gentlemen?" And we're like, "We're Spencer and Peter from Cockroach Labs." And I kind of felt awkward in saying that every single time, like they're going to laugh. But the receptionists, God bless them, not one of them even smirked at that. They're just like, "All right, just take a seat. We'll be right with you." It was just business.
Yeah, there are a lot of silly names in the startup world. So,
I mean, Google before it became Google was a pretty weird name. It's like, what is that? Like what a baby makes as a noise? Now it's like, well, nobody laughs too much at Google.
Yeah, not anymore at least. So obviously, Cockroach has come a long way from those early days, and I think it's interesting, especially for the students here. Like, you're obviously doing lots of hiring in a bunch of different areas, and you have ambitions, to grow the company even more. So, for someone who's maybe graduating now, thinking about Cockroach, what can you tell them about the business? Why should they come work for you? Who are the sorts of people that you're looking to bring in to now what is not an early stage startup, but actually probably a kind of like growth to later stage startup?
I got an answer for that if you want me to start, Pete.
Go for it.
I think that for folks that are interested on this call, if, I wouldn't want to discourage anyone from going and starting their company if they've got an incredible idea and they really want to, become an entrepreneur immediately and not wait. But if you're a little bit more hesitant or you're not really sure exactly how you go about this, I think there's huge value in getting some industry experience, especially and crucially at a company that's doing particularly well. And I think also one that's not doing well the way Amazon or Google is doing well right now, but one that's doing well that's pre-IPO, where there's a lot of room for growth in your career and learning experience. Because at a company that's pre-IPO, let's say it's got somewhere between 100 and 400 or 500 employees pre-IPO, the growth opportunities are just enormous. You can pick up things that there's just not enough people to handle. Yet it's crucial, absolutely crucial to business, but nobody's dealing with it. This happened at Google all the time. If you went and you saw something interesting and you kind of became the expert at it, even if it was in your, say, 20% free time, that would, people would love you for it and they'd reward you for it. Like, oh, wow, Spencer's become the sort of owner of this thing that's been dropped now for 6 months and everyone knows it needs to be done, but we can't hire somebody to do it, or we just haven't been able to yet. And now, that you just become the known expert on that going forward, and everyone is extremely grateful. So that obviously can have great knock-on effects in your career. And if you go to a big company like Google in 2020, well, you're just going to be a very, very small part of a huge effort. It is very successful. You can learn great things from it, do great work. But I don't think that you can really accelerate your career in the way that you can at a smaller company. And I think that the truly beneficial aspect to having some industry experience before starting a company, and this is something I wish I could tell my earlier self, is that you have an opportunity to meet other extremely good people in a context that's very exciting, where you understand, you see in action how a business grows and succeeds in a particular industry. And those people that you're ultimately going to feel like you're in the trenches with, those become colleagues which you'll end up having lifetime collaborations with. And so they're very good co-founders.
Yeah, I kind of add on to some of what Spencer was saying there about if you're starting, your company right out of school. I mean, these founders who do that, wow, that is an impressive feat. You're adding an extra layer of difficulty on. Oftentimes, you don't have a network built up. You just have your network of, kind of college, colleagues, and it's not the same as like the network you build up working in a job. I mean, I certainly, after my first job, I went off and did a startup, and who were some of the employees there? Who's my co-founder? Someone I met at that first job. It just turns out that I met Spencer in college, but plenty of the employees, we have employees who came from Square, we had employees we worked with at Google, and you just kind of accrete these people. It's really hard to do that coming straight out of school. I mentioned early on that I think founding a company, it is like an incredible learning experience, except that learning experience is going to be through trial and error to a great degree, and some of those errors are going to be painful. Spencer and I, founding Cockroach, we made errors. I just feel like we've made fewer of them because we had all our previous experiences. I can't say that it's been error-free. We've definitely had our stumbles and fumbles, but we've been able to recover from them for a variety of reasons. And a huge part of that is the experience that we came into the company with. If you're having to either by luck or by just kind of effort pick up from those errors, that's just a harder thing to do. And people make it work. Snapchat founder, he came out directly out of college, founded Snapchat, went like gangbusters. We were doing something in a similar space after 10 years of experience in Google, and we fumbled. I think there's a huge amount of luck there. The guy's extremely smart as well. I think that maybe not the safe path, but a safer path to entrepreneurship is getting some experience at a mid-sized company. You have plenty of opportunity to see like the inner workings, working with customers, the interactions between all the departments. I think the size we're currently at is a really good size that's balancing that risk, but also the learning opportunities are still tremendous.
Yeah, it can be tempting to start really early somewhere. And there's no shortage of opportunities to do that. But I think it's important for everyone to understand that startups most often fail. And so, for that first job out of college to really ride to have the complete journey, to go through an IPO and everything. It's very easy to do that. I don't want to jinx anything, but it's pretty easy to do that when you go to a company where the writing's pretty much on the wall. It's just, you'll hear it from a lot of people, advisors and things. And when you can ask, oh, well, this company, they have a really good shot. Look at who their investors are, look at their growth rate. So, get some advice there. But, it's relatively easy to find a company that's going to have you're going to have a really good experience at. If you start too early, the company's only 20, 30 people. I mean, they could be backed by Sequoia or Benchmark, but, there's just a high rate of failure in the startup. And that's a company that's still trying to find, some level of product market fit. And there's a good chance that they're not going to make it. And those experiences, when things aren't going well and you're really just trying to keep swinging, trying to make it a success, listen, you're still going to learn there. I don't want to discourage anyone from doing it, but it's I think for that first job, it can be, listen, a company that's really got that momentum and is headed for that IPO, the number of great people that join, that's really how you build your network. So it's just to Pete's point about risk, there's a lot of things that you can make trade-offs on that will change the risk profile. But finding the company that's far along, that has the most momentum, and also great investors and great people working there, that's the best way to manage that risk and have a good jump start to the career.
Yep. Guys, thank you for that. I think that's really great advice. So I think those are the rest of the questions from me. I think now we're going to do a little audience Q&A.
Yep. That was awesome. It was so fascinating. And we have some questions up, but I think Rishi wanted to start and ask a question first. Rishi?
Yeah, it sounds great. Well, first of all, just thanks so much for the time. I mean, it's been a really great, fun conversation so far. But kind of quick question is just like, I know one thing you mentioned a bit earlier was just in terms of timing. So timing when, building a company, looking at a market, looking at space, how do you know if it's right? Or I guess like, what is your kind of gut feeling there? And how do you kind of think about approaching that, especially from like a student coming out of college or just anyone trying to build something in the space?
Well, I think one factor is just listening to people, what the reactions are to your idea. I mean, it was kind of fascinating. We took Viewfinder out, we were telling people about it, and people were kind of interested in what we were doing, but the reactions were, I would say, lukewarm. And the difference when we actually, took out the idea for Cockroach DB and Cockroach Labs and kind of shopped it around, the reactions we were getting were, I mean, you can hear the sonic boom of the VCs reaching for their checkbook. That's how fast they were going. It was pretty incredible difference. But it wasn't just them. Everybody heard that idea and they're like, this is great. The timing is right for this. To give you some more kind of color there, Google had released a paper on Spanner. I think it was 2 years before that we founded Cockroach Labs. And that paper on Spanner had been making the rounds for the VCs. VCs pay attention to the papers coming out of the big companies, and they're looking to see like, well, we've known that Google released a paper on Bigtable and on GFS, and that formed the whole Hadoop ecosystem with HBase and some of the other technologies there, the MapReduce technologies. They were looking for that next kind of ecosystem after HBase. And the Google Spanner paper came out, the VCs knew about this, and that was actually one of the kind of approximate reasons we decided to jump ship from Square. One of the VCs reached out to Spencer after hearing about Cockroach DB and was like, I know about Spanner, I know about Cockroach DB. Wow, okay, time to get going. But I mean, so this is like maybe like kind of the perfect storm of situation there. I think the general rule is like, you got to tell your idea to people. Certainly don't hold your idea secret, and then hear what people's reactions are. If people are leaning forward and being like, oh, tell me more, or if they're just like a little bit like, I don't understand it. If they don't understand it, it doesn't mean it's a bad idea. You have to tell more people, but you got to find some who are enthusiastic about the idea.
Yeah, definitely. Talking to VCs, this is a huge reason to go for institutional money. I mean, as Pete said, they might not really understand your technology. Some of them can. Certainly they won't understand the way you do or your business opportunity, because you're thinking about it 24/7 before you get to the point where you're pitching it. So, but what they do bring is they understand, especially the good ones, the competitors in your space, and sort of they understand the timing most likely better than you do because they have more of a gestalt that's ecosystem wide, certainly the good ones. And also, I want to reiterate Pete's point about just making sure that ideas get a complete and as complete a hearing and as much sunlight on them as possible. Many entrepreneurs, first-time entrepreneurs, and even serial entrepreneurs, in my experience, are very cagey about ideas. They don't want to share ideas. They want people to sign NDAs because they're very certain that ideas have just tremendous value in and of themselves. And I just want to tell everyone here that my opinion is that ideas are pretty much not worth the paper that you might print them on or the PowerPoint bits that you might store them in. Whatever idea you have, no matter how great it is, someone else has already had it. Timing and execution are everything. You can't really control timing except for obviously talking to more people about your idea. That can at least give you an idea of how good the timing is. But you can control execution, and that's every successful entrepreneur's superpower is that they can put their nose to the grindstone and they can just execute. They're just a singular focus, one track mind, and they keep pounding away on it until, I mean, persistence is very valuable in this particular pursuit. So yeah, I mean, talking to VCs, talking to everyone, tell them everything about your idea. They'll say, hey, this sounds a lot like this other company that's doing something else. And you'd never even heard of them. And that can be like a pretty disconcerting experience. Like, oh no, these guys are already doing it and they're doing it 10 times better than our idea. And you spend 2 days, you're looking at it, you're despondent, and 3 more days later and you're like, wait, but they're not doing this. And this is something I think we could do it really well. And so then the next pitch you have, it's incorporating all of what you were challenged by. And that's incredibly important. So yeah, don't make ideas precious, but drive for extreme persistence.
That's great. Just Steve, thank you, Rishi. You had an interesting question for the co-founders.
Cool, awesome. Firstly, thank you so much for the energy. I really enjoyed the stories you guys told, especially how you came up with the name of Cockroach. I will be thinking of weird names. I was actually quite curious about what your perspective on was when it comes to founding a startup as a team rather than a solo founder. I've heard quite a bit about how like having a team has certain liabilities, whereas if you have like your own thing, basically, you're able to have greater autonomy, greater control. So I was wondering, what were your perspectives on some of the strengths and challenges from your experiences?
Want to take this, Spencer?
Well, I mean, you can. Yeah, I'm happy to lead off on it. I actually prefer to have a co-founder or co-founders. I think it's pretty lonely at the top when you're really in charge of everything and it's all on your shoulders, and it's really nice to be able to lean on people. But the flip side to that is if you have the wrong co-founders, it's worse than being solo. And that was my point very much about why it's so important to build up that network and have other collaborators that have been in the trenches with you through good times and bad times, especially, and that you have built up tremendous respect for, because those people are much more likely to go the distance with you and be people that you can lean on when the times do get rough. And so, yeah, I'm very grateful that Peter is my co-founder. I don't know how I would be able to do it alone for all these years.
Yeah, I'll echo that. I mean, there are parts of founding a company that are kind of soul crushing at times, where you feel like everything's kind of collapsing in, and not being alone at that time is very nice. It's very nice to have other people. It's like, sometimes I feel it's like you're carrying a baton and you're having to sprint for something and you're reaching the end, and it's great when you can hand it off and someone else can take it up for a little bit. You can get a breather. If you're a solo co-founder, you're not going to get that. But one of the other flip sides about like having a co-founder involved is you frequently want to co-found a company with a friend, and I would strongly advise that you have worked with that friend. You want to co-found a company with someone you've worked with before, knowing what they're going to be like under stressful situations, under time pressure, when things get tense. Are they going to blow up? Did they have spurts of anger? Maybe they do, but maybe that's all right. But knowing intimately what it's like to work with them is extremely important. At Viewfinder, we actually, one of our co-founders, our other co-founders, they were friends. We hadn't worked with them before. That didn't end up working too well. And things kind of blew up after that. And I don't know if we could have seen that going in, but I'd just be very cautious about ever, getting a co-founder that you don't know intimately. And that is more than just friendship. It is seeing the way they work up close.
Awesome, thank you.
That's great. Kenza, I think you also had a question, and then we'll go to Ari after that.
Yeah, so hello, my question is like, since having you all raised, Spencer and Peter, you raised 85 million from like top investors like Sequoia and Benchmark. So what advice would you give to like students who are starting a career in startups? What's the best way to approach investors for your idea?
So actually, that was this most recent round. We raised almost 200 million now for this company. Listen, my advice for investors is to be straightforward. You never, ever, ever want to lie or even stretch the truth. But what you can do that's a lot more powerful than trying to build your thing up to be better than it is to simply level with everyone. A lot of entrepreneurs don't do that, and I believe that investors really appreciate it. So, just telling them where they are and how serious you are about them, who else is being considered. I never balk at giving them the actual numbers. It's just, like trying to play guessing games and, psychological pressures in order to get a valuation up. Honestly, whoever wins, quote unquote, wins the deal and leads the round, they're going to be, especially in the early rounds, with you for the entire duration. Kind of like a co-founder. And you're going to want a relationship built on trust. So I think the right way to approach it is to be very straightforward. And ultimately, when you do that, even an investor that doesn't want to invest ultimately in your company, they're going to probably become someone that'd be willing to advise you and ultimately potentially be part of another future round. So, just treat everyone with respect and be transparent.
Thank you.
Actually, Erik, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on it also.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with everything that Spencer said. I think I think what you can show early on is the things that get the VC excited. Like, be very transparent about who's on your team, what market are you attacking, what's the potential for the business over the next 12 months, 24 months, even years into the future. And I think there's I won't go through the sort of pitch deck 101. I mean, you can sort of Google that and find all these different things, but there really is a difference between an entrepreneur that has a very clear vision of where things are going to go and has kind of pulled together the team that's right for it. I was mentioning, Spencer and Peter building a globally distributed database. They're probably one of, maybe two teams in the world that had the right experience to go and build something like Cockroach. And that's what's going to attract like the biggest numbers of VC dollars. So you need to find out why, explain what you're doing, why you're the right team to do it. We talked about timing, that's another one too, if you can speak to that. The more that you can sort of clearly communicate your ideas and why you're the right one to attack an opportunity, the more the VC is going to get excited. And it's kind of, in some ways you're doing the VC's work for them in terms of how they might diligence an opportunity, but that's attractive because that means that you've done all the work to sort of de-risk it for them. And that's going to, be hopefully the beginning of a good partnership. And again, completely agree with Spencer. If you have some holes in that, no entrepreneur is going to have all the answers on day one. I think it's totally fine to be transparent that, hey, this is something we're still figuring out, and maybe just talk about how you're going to do it. But that's much better than trying to, exaggerate or, misdirect and trying to do things like that, because, ultimately it's the investor's job to sort of, do the diligence. And if they figure out that it's not all the way there, that's probably not going to lead to an investment decision.
One other thing, Erik, that just reminded from our earlier conversations, since we're dispensing advice here. I did mention going to a place that looks like it has a very successful trajectory. It's not. One other important aspect to that is you're going to end up at that particular kind of a place, often having the ability to get a fairly lead role on building some new piece of technology or some new product, or whether, you know, that could be that you're a computer scientist, it could be that you're a marketer, it could be you're a business development person, but that kind of experience in one of those companies that's succeeding is often where you have extreme credibility when you go become an entrepreneur and they're talking. It's exactly what Erik's saying, that team aspect, you know, saying at this point, let's say that you've been working at Snowflake, and let's say you spend another 2 years there, and Snowflake continues to be a huge success like it's been. You know, if you can go to a potential investor and say, I was one of the founding members of this particular team at Snowflake that built this, that really helped, you know, them find the success that they've enjoyed. That is worth its weight in gold for sure.
That is really helpful. Peter, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything or maybe respond to Aria's next question.
I mean, the one thing I could add is it's really helpful to have a co-founder who loves talking to VCs, and that's what I have. I'd say that's the best thing you should do, is find that co-founder who just loves to give the pitch over and over again and doesn't get tired of it. Every now and then I hear Spencer give the pitch, and he still does it with energy and enthusiasm, and I don't know how he musters it, but get yourself one of those.
Yeah, I mean, and if you want some advice on how to never have flagging energy when you're pitching the same thing 1,000 times, it must be that many at least by now, do something you're passionate about. And it's, sure, that's advice that you've gotten before, but you know, that's, if you're scratching your own itch, you understand the customer pretty well, right? And it does give you that sort of fire in your belly in terms of, I really want to solve this problem, and it's never really going to be good enough. You're always going to see the next mountain when you get at the top of the peak that you've just been climbing. So that helps.
Thanks. Aria, I know you had a specific question. I don't know if you've changed, but thank you for being so patient.
Yeah, of course. First of all, guys, thank you so much for giving your time. Spencer, I really like your bed. It caught my attention. So here's my question. So I had one question and you guys started talking about co-founders. So here it is. So I was in the Berkeley method of entrepreneurship, and I started something with my friend who's my co-founder, but we both don't have technical backgrounds. So here's my question. How do we pitch our idea to a potential technical co-founder? Because, obviously we're not going to be doing, most of the work in the beginning. And I feel like it's, when we approach it, it's like, okay, you do all the work and we'll take care of everything afterwards. And I feel like it feels almost unfair. So, from your perspectives, how should we go about doing this?
Well, there's a lot of competition for technical co-founders. I'm sure you've already discovered,
Yeah.
Even at Cockroach Labs, it's a very, very technical kind of company. And you think that make it, and it is in fact easier to get certain kinds of engineers. It's still hard for us. I mean, we're competing with Google, right? Google's hiring 100 times more people in the same space of time than we can even hope to hire. And so that's a lot of pressure. I think that if you want a good technical co-founder, you got to make them believe in the idea as much as you do. And that's just the critical thing. So, it helps if it's fairly technical, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, at Viewfinder, the other two co-founders that Peter and I had weren't technical, but they did interest us because it was a private photo sharing company, and both Peter and I aren't very public and don't like posting things in social media, but we do want to share photos with everyone and have discussions with groups of friends and things. And so that was interesting enough to us that we believed in the idea. And obviously, you don't want your technical co-founder, I mean, I don't think you should want your technical co-founder to just go into the back room and produce code. You really want them to help you ideate and to push back and say, I don't think that's the right way. How about this way? You obviously want the right personality type too. A lot of factors in there, but definitely getting somebody, we have to do it too. We want if you're competing for talent right now, you have to get them on board with the idea and give them ownership as well.
Sounds like it helps to know someone's little brother. Peter, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's a tough challenge for a non-technical founder to find a technical co-founder. You have to be tapping into friend networks, get some relationship there. I know there's meetups to help make those introductions, but I think that's I mentioned this earlier. You want to have a co-founder that you've worked with in the trenches. before. And so it's just going to be a challenge. I don't have any good advice for you other than, finding that it's going to be one of the major challenges of doing your company, is to find that, that person who you really trust and can believe also in the vision of what you're doing. There might be an aspect, I don't even know if this is a good idea, but trying to bootstrap the idea, get a demo. You can get contractors to do a demo of something for you, but you're not going to be able to actually run the company that way. You're going to need someone supremely technical on the inside to be running the engineering efforts.
Yeah, I might just tack on. I like what Peter said. If you kind of fake it till you make it, you either hire someone on a contract basis or whatever to just sort of get enough traction that you can get people excited. But really, when you're bringing in technical talent, like whether it's kind of the first person in like a founder level, or it's the 100th engineer at a bigger startup, you're competing with this talent with these giant companies that are paying ridiculous salaries. And the way that you pull someone away from that, very comfortable life inside of a big company is you get aligned in the mission, right? And that you're just gonna have to find someone that has that same level of passion. I mean, kind of what Spencer was saying, like having that fire in their belly. So whatever you're building, go to the places, whether it's, meetups or somewhere else, where those people have the same level of passion. And then it's just about finding a technical person that's in that circle. And I find that that's going to work much better than just sort of generically looking for someone who's technical and then trying to convince them that what you're doing is the right thing.
Thank you, guys.
That's really awesome. Ari, I know had a question later, but I didn't want to forget. Maya Bickert had a question. I think Rishi was going to ask it.
Yeah, so I guess unfortunately Maya had to leave a little early, but I guess kind of asking on behalf of her. And what her question is that essentially, there's so many paths where students can really take out of college, right? And she's, I guess, kind of struggling beside, like, should she pursue, like, for example, med school, MBA, getting involved with startups? So I guess how would you think about like someone kind of approaching the start of like, how do you kind of figure out your path coming out of school? And then maybe along with that, what are the sort of skill sets you really should develop at this kind of stage?
Well, it helps if there's something that you're really passionate about in terms of an interest and you can directly pursue. I think if that's a possibility, that's great. I wouldn't necessarily, based on my experience, think that going to do an MBA directly out of school would be as good as going and getting some real world experience first and then going and get an MBA. I think MBAs, they're a huge opportunity to network. And I think a lot of what you learn in an MBA program, there's not much to hang that knowledge on in terms of context if you haven't been out in the real world for some time. But when you do have that real world experience, all of the different things that you learn about in terms of case studies and things where you're studying for an MBA, they just make sense. There's like slots in your experience and your understanding of the world where this information fits neatly into it or sort of expands them, but you're not kind of doing everything from scratch. So I would wait on an MBA personally. If someone's interested in being a doctor, med school is the right thing to go to for sure. So I think that one's pretty obvious, but there's also kind of an interesting potential now. There's so much cross-disciplinary stuff. And I think if you're interested in, for example, brain-computer interfaces, going to med school would be a really interesting stop along the way. So yeah, just, again, I think that would come back to what are you passionate about? Where do the true interests lie? And you're just gonna have so much more fun in life if that's what you're pursuing, just something that sates a deep curiosity.
I think there's an opportunity nowadays too, which is if you're not quite sure what your interests are, but you have some kind of, I don't know, a mild interest that you want to, scratch. If you were interested in brain-computer interfaces, go work in Elon Musk's company, Neuralink. Just ask for the entry-level job, get in the door. I think there's this aspect of like we're like startups are tackling all sorts of different industries and different opportunities, and almost no matter what your interests are, you can probably find a startup that aligns with that, and you can dabble in it for a couple of years and see if there's a match. Or maybe you get in there and you work at Neuralink for a while and you realize actually this level of science is horrible because what they're doing is they're implanting electrodes in pigs' brains and you don't like that blood, or whatever it is. Or maybe you just determine this is actually what your passion is. And because of that, you have to quit Neuralink and go get your PhD and postdoc so you can actually be doing the implanting the electrodes in the pig's brain. It's hard to predict these things. And I think there is some aspect of, I hear this from new grads about wanting to chart out their career. And I gotta say, my career has kind of it's been a winding course. There's been no straight path. And I certainly didn't know I couldn't predict it 25 years ago when I was graduating, where I was gonna end up. That would be where I'm at today. And I think there's at least in the, if you're in computer science and software engineering, but just generally in the startup realm, there's an opportunity to take these winding paths. If you start down one, it turns out not to be a good idea, you can still, adjust course 2-3 years later, even when you're 30. 30 is, it probably feels ancient to many of you, but now at the hefty age of 45, 30 feels incredibly young. You have your entire future ahead of you at 30. Don't lock yourself in too early.
Oh, Victoria, you're muted, by the way.
Yes, but I'm sure I look good with my hands moving. I'm conscious of the time, and I'm hoping you can stay for a minute or two longer because Ari had a question, but I'm going to share our passcode. And before I share that, though, I want to just say thank you. It was really, really awesome. I don't know if you can hear all that applause, but I'll go ahead and share our screen. And then while I'm doing that, Aria, you had another question.
Yeah, I'm back. So here's my question. You guys mentioned being in the trenches and, entrepreneurship isn't beautiful. There are, many dark moments, and I'm sure there are points where you probably even thought of quitting or stopping. So my question is, what pushed you guys to keep going, in those moments where, you were just, things weren't going your way, or, the potential for failure was very high. What kept you guys going, and what advice do you have for entrepreneurs to keep pushing on?
Yeah, I think there's a certain amount of, your internal kind of personality and fortitude for doing these things, your tolerance for suffering. I think there's a huge amount of having a co-founder. When things are tough, having the co-founder, seeing their optimistic attitude, and Spencer might have been faking along at certain times, but he sold me. And I imagine vice versa. He was probably struggling. I'm like, come on, Spencer, keep on going for a little while longer. And oftentimes you're in the trenches of something, and it feels like there's no way you can get out. But if you just hold on for a while longer, you just keep on, doing the work. We had a period of time where there was deep stability problems with Cockroach DB. It felt like they're never going to end. And but there was, we kept on plugging away at it. And things got better slowly, and then eventually it crossed a tipping point where, it's not like the product was perfect at that point, but we could see that this thing was going to get to where we wanted it to be. Yeah, I would say, that there's that. I think there's, what is it? Can't remember the name of it, the entrepreneur or the VC, but he talks about just never giving up. That's some attitude you have to go into it with.
And
who are
Horowitz,
the
maybe.
entrepreneurs that make it? They're the ones who just never quit.
Yeah, and I think part of what makes it easy not to quit, or easier, is when you are, again, truly building something you're passionate about, that you understand that you would be a customer of, because we're building open source software. So I've always felt that, hey, if Cockroach, the timing's not right, if we don't get industry buy-in and everyone starts to really use Cockroach, at least the open source thing I'm using is something I would use, or sorry, that we're building is something I'm going to use in my next step. I know it's good enough that I'd use it. So as long as that's true, got to keep going, because, it's onto something, right? So having that base gut level of belief is obviously something that can help carry you through the dark times.
I appreciate that. Erik, I don't know if you had any nice summarizing GV thoughts.
Yeah, I think in that case, it's, being an entrepreneur is one of the hardest jobs out there. In some ways, to get started on that career path, It requires suspending disbelief. It requires thinking that you really are going to change the world in some way. And, you know, I agree with what Spencer was saying. Like, you kind of have to just build something that you care so much about that you're just willing to do these, you know, somewhat unnatural things to bend the world into the way you think it should go. So, you know, it is very hard, but I think, you know, almost every successful entrepreneur I've worked with, you know, they just get energy from spending time on their company, and you're going to end up spending a ton of time on your company. So if you have the drive and passion to do whatever it is that your business is going to do, you know, you'll find that from within. And I think that if it doesn't give you the energy, you'll very quickly find that, you know, maybe you should be starting a different type of company, or, you know, just taking a pause and sort of reevaluating if entrepreneurship is for you, because it's an incredibly difficult journey. But, you know, I think the best entrepreneurs barely see it as working. They just see it as kind of creating something new. And that gives you all the positivity that you need to go through very kind of dark and challenging moments.
I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
Probably a wonderful way to end the evening. Thank you for creating such a lovely space for us tonight. It has been fantastic. I wish everybody a good and safe evening. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, Erik. Go Beavers, go Bears. Beavers are MIT, right, Erik? Right,
Is that really right? Better than trees, I guess.
Go Bears. Thank you all. Have a good night, and we'll see you around.
All right.
Thanks,
Good
guys.
night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rishi. Thanks, Swetha. Oh, I see Mike is there. Hopefully he'll talk next time. Bye, David, if you're still there. I hope you're driving.